Imagine that someone you love sends you a one-word message, fine, no period, no explanation, just that word, sitting on the screen like a closed door. Before you can stop it, a person appears in your mind. Maybe they are angry, maybe they are withdrawing, maybe this is proof that the distance you have been feeling is real. Your body changes before you know what you believe. Your shoulders tighten. You rehearse a defense. You answer the person you think is there. Then, hours later, you learn that they wrote the message while walking into an emergency room with someone they love. The word did not change. The person did not suddenly become a different person, but the mind you assigned to them collapsed, and another took its place. So here is the question at the entrance to mind mirrors. What if you never see people exactly as they really are? Not because other people are illusions, not because behavior tells us nothing, but because every encounter arrives through a living model, part observation, part memory, part prediction, part culture, and part unfinished story from your own life. You do not meet another mind without mediation. You meet a face, a voice, a pause, an action, a history. From those signals, your mind builds a person, and most of the time, it builds quickly. In a well-known experiment, participants saw photographs of unfamiliar faces for as little as 1/10 of a second. That brief exposure was enough for them to form judgments about qualities such as trustworthiness, competence, and aggressiveness. Giving them more time often increased confidence and produced judgments that resembled the first ones. That finding is easy to turn into a myth. It does not mean 1/10 of a second reveals someone's character. It means the machinery of impression is fast. Speed is not the same as accuracy, and confidence is not the same as contact with truth. The first image is more like a sketch than a portrait. But because the sketch arrives before conscious reflection, it can feel less like an interpretation and more like simple seeing. You do not think, I am constructing a provisional estimate from limited cues. You think, he looks arrogant. She seems safe. They are hiding something. The grammar of the judgment erases the judge. This is where the story turns. Seeing another person is not passive reception. It is an active prediction. The brain is continuously trying to make the next moment less surprising. In social life, that means estimating what another person knows, wants, feels, and may do next. Neuroscientists often call part of this capacity mentalizing, or theory of mind. Research has identified a network of brain regions that participates when people reason about beliefs and intentions. One influential study found that a region near the temporoparietal junction responded more when participants considered the contents of another person's mind than when they read merely physical descriptions. But there is no tiny observer inside the brain reading souls. The network does not give you direct access to private experience. It helps construct an informed guess from available evidence. Think of it as an internal weather model. A weather model can track real pressure, wind, and temperature. It can be useful enough to save lives. It is still not the sky. Your model of another person can also be useful. Tone matters. Patterns matter. Promises kept and broken matter. The danger begins when a model forgets that it is a model. When information is missing, the mind does not leave a clean, empty space. It reaches for prior experience. If silence once meant punishment, a quiet partner may feel hostile. If charm once concealed danger, warmth may feel strategic. If your family treated disagreement as rejection, a different opinion may sound like abandonment. Sometimes those predictions protect us. Sometimes they repeat an old world inside a new room. And sometimes we use ourselves as the template. Classic research on the false consensus effect found that people often overestimated how common their own choices and responses were. People who chose differently could then seem unusually revealing, unreasonable, or extreme. In close relationships, something similar can happen through assumed similarity. Partners can be genuinely accurate about one another, while also projecting some of their own feelings onto the other person. Accuracy and projection are not opposites. They can occupy the same judgment. You may know that someone is tired and still be wrong about why. You may correctly sense distance and incorrectly decide what it means. A perception can contain evidence, memory, and invention in a single emotional sentence. But here's the question most people miss. Why does your interpretation feel objective while theirs feels biased? Research on the bias blind spot suggests that people often recognize cognitive and motivational bias more readily in others than in themselves. We can inspect our own reasons and intentions from the inside. We encounter another person's mind through speech and behavior. That difference gives our own interpretation a feeling of innocence. I consider the facts. You are being emotional. I am responding to what happened. You are projecting. Two people can stand in the same kitchen, remember the same argument, and each experience the other as the one who distorted reality. This is not proof that every account is equally true. Cameras, messages, witnesses, patterns, and consequences can establish important facts. Power can be abused. Harm can be denied. Epistemic humility must never become a demand that someone distrust clear evidence for their own mistreatment. The point is narrower and more difficult. Facts do not automatically reveal every motive, meaning, or inner state. Even when you know what a person did, the total person remains larger than your explanation of the act. Modern life intensifies this problem because so much of the person arrives without the person. A photograph without the hour before it. A post without the private argument that followed. A typing indicator that appears, disappears, and becomes evidence in a trial, held entirely inside your mind. Online, we often receive fragments designed for speed and treat them as windows designed for truth. We read a biography from a facial expression, a moral character from a 15-second clip, an entire relationship from a caption. Sometimes the fragments document something important. Sometimes they have been selected, edited, or removed from the conditions that would change their meaning. The discipline is not to distrust everything. It is to match the strength of the conclusion to the strength of the evidence. Labels make this especially difficult. Once a person becomes selfish, difficult, brilliant, safe, toxic, enlightened, or broken, new behavior is pulled toward the label. A generous act becomes manipulation. A mistake becomes proof. A contradiction becomes hypocrisy instead of evidence that the person was never as simple as the category. But complexity does not mean that character is imaginary. People build habits. Repeated choices become patterns. Some patterns deserve trust, and some deserve distance. A model becomes dangerous not because it contains judgment, but because it can no longer distinguish a pattern from a prison. The question is not whether you should form conclusions. Life requires them. The question is whether your conclusions remain accountable to reality. Familiarity helps, but it creates another danger. Over time, we collect thousands of observations about someone. We learn their rhythms. We can hear fatigue in a single breath. We notice when their ordinary laugh has gone missing. Close knowledge can become remarkably precise, yet the same archive can freeze a person in place. The child who lied at 12 becomes the adult nobody trusts at 30. The friend who once disappeared becomes the person whose every delay confirms abandonment. The partner who used to avoid conflict becomes permanently avoidant, even after years of learning to stay. Sometimes we do not see the person in front of us. We see the most emotionally expensive version of them we have ever known. Now, the deeper question is not whether our models are imperfect. They have to be. The deeper question is whether they can change.
Research on impression updating suggests that they can. When new behavior conflicts with an established impression, people sometimes revise the model, especially when the new information seems highly diagnostic. In some experiments, one striking piece of counter-evidence was enough to reverse an evaluation. But updating is not the same as erasing. A new act enters a history. We decide whether it is an exception, a performance, a misunderstanding, or evidence that our picture was incomplete. This is why change can be lonely. A person may do the work of becoming different while remaining trapped inside the predictions of everyone who knew them before. And this is why forgiveness, when it is safe and freely chosen, is partly an act of perception. It does not declare that nothing happened. It allows new evidence to become possible. Philosophy has lived with this distance for centuries. The problem of other minds asks how we know that another being has an inner life at all, and how we know what is happening within it. Some answers appeal to analogy. Their body behaves as mine does when I feel pain, so the best explanation is that they feel pain too. Others emphasize testimony, behavior, direct perception, or the meaning created through interaction. There is no single solution accepted by everyone. Yet daily life cannot wait for philosophical certainty. We trust cries, smiles, language, consistency, and care. We treat other people as centers of experience, because that is the most coherent explanation of the human world. And because the ethical cost of refusing their inwardness is enormous. Maybe the distance between minds is not a defect to eliminate.
Maybe it is the condition that makes listening necessary. If another person could be completely contained by your model, they would no longer be another person. They would be a character in your private world. To recognize someone as real is to accept that they can surprise you. They can know something about themselves that you do not. They can also misunderstand themselves. So can you. This uncertainty is not helplessness. It can become a discipline. First, separate observation from interpretation. Observation, they answered 3 hours later. Interpretation, they do not care. The interpretation may eventually be supported, but naming the difference prevents the conclusion from disguising itself as raw data. Second, ask what else could be true. Not every imaginable excuse deserves belief. The question simply loosens the grip of the first story long enough for evidence to enter. Third, invite first-person testimony. Ask before announcing, what happened for you? What did you mean? Then listen for both the answer and whether future behavior supports it. Fourth, update without abandoning pattern recognition. One kind moment does not cancel repeated cruelty. One failure does not define an entire life. Mature perception can hold a boundary and remain revisable. Finally, notice when the past has entered the room wearing someone else's face. You can test this practice with the last interaction that unsettled you. Write down only what a camera and microphone could have recorded. Then write the meaning you assign to it. Then ask which part came from the present and which part came from an older pattern.
You may discover that your first interpretation still fits. Clarity is not the enemy of humility, but sometimes a small opening appears between what happened and the story that rushed in to own it. Inside that opening, a question becomes possible. So does a boundary. So does a correction. So does the first honest conversation two private worlds have managed in years. The goal is not to see without a lens. No human being does that. The goal is to become responsible for the lens, to know when it is helping, when it is wounded, when it is protecting you, and when it is preventing another person from arriving. Perhaps love is not the achievement of perfect knowledge. Perhaps love is the decision to keep meeting someone after the first explanation feels complete. You may never see another person exactly as they are in themselves, but you can see more truthfully. You can observe more carefully, ask more honestly, revise more courageously, and leave room for a life that exceeds your interpretation. And as Mind Mirrors begins, consider this: which person in your life might still be living inside an old version of your mind?